The chief engineer mocked a black construction worker during a meeting on the construction site, unaware that the person he was insulting was the CEO who would fire him in front of everyone. "Can you be quiet and let the professional speak?" Marcus Ellison's voice cut through the air, cold as steel, echoing through the makeshift meeting room on the dusty construction site like a brutal hammer strike. "We don't pay construction workers to think, just to follow orders." The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned towards Jamal Carter, the 42-year-old black man in a worn-out work uniform. He didn't speak right away. His throat tightened, not from fear, but from the simmering anger building up like lava trapped beneath a layer of calm. His so-called unprofessional behavior, according to Marcus, was simply pointing out an issue. The foundation design at the northeast corner ignored the natural slope of the ground. "With all due respect, sir," Jamal spoke clearly and slowly, "the terrain slope will cause misalignment stress. If the foundation is not reinforced, uneven settlement is unavoidable." Marcus sneered, then turned to the group of engineers and managers standing silently behind him. "Did you hear that? Now even the construction worker is analyzing the structure. Maybe I should hand him my Stanford master's degree, such knowledge wasted on cement work." A few forced laughs echoed, not because it was funny, but because those laughing didn't want to become Marcus's next target. Jamal didn't laugh. He didn't bow his head. He simply closed the blueprint, his gaze unwavering. But it was that gaze that unsettled Marcus. It held no fear, just a calmness that made others wary. Marcus took a step closer, holding his pointer like he was giving a lecture. "This is why we have layers of management. So people like me make the decisions, and people like you follow." At that moment, no one realized that Marcus's arrogance was not new. It was the result of years of being praised, of dozens of projects where the opinions of those below him were never considered a threat. But today, he had chosen the wrong person to insult. Jamal gave a slight nod. "I just thought I should speak up before it becomes a bigger issue." Marcus clapped twice, like an actor finishing his lead role. "All right, thanks, Engineer Carter, for your input. Now, let's get back to reality. The construction plan needs to move faster. No one wants delays because of personal feelings." The meeting continued as if nothing had happened. But at that very moment when Jamal pulled out his old Nokia phone from his pocket, typed a short message with just 11 characters, and pressed send, the entire power balance of the Eaglestone construction site had quietly begun to shift toward the one they had mistakenly thought was at the bottom. The last remnants of Marcus's mocking laughter hung in the stifling heat of the midday sun. Facing him, Jamal Carter remained poised, his hand still resting on the edge of the blueprint, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the foundation structure that he knew was problematic. But those eyes no longer held any surprise. Instead, they reflected something else. A wearied familiarity with the sweet arrogant society often reserved for someone like him. A construction worker trying to teach a design engineer? Why not just give him a Stanford degree while you're at it? Marcus Ellison, still standing with his weight off center, shoulders tilted, his left hand stuffed in his trousers pocket and his right waving aimlessly in the air, his expression as if he were performing a comedic scene in a sitcom that no one had asked for. A few white engineers behind him laughed, though it wasn't entirely genuine. Greg, the project's senior structural engineer, chuckled awkwardly, his eyes darting briefly toward Jamal as if to say, "I don't agree, but I'm not brave enough to speak up." A few younger engineers exchanged glances, mouths pressed into thin, tight smiles. The kind of smile you give when you want to avoid trouble with the boss but don't find anything funny. As for the workers, they were silent. the kind of silence that only those who have long been cast into the role of the ones who aren't allowed to speak when superiors are present understand. A few stared at the ground, while others looked at Jamal as if holding their breath. They knew him, the only one on the team who could hold his head high without being seen as arrogant. In the long silence, Jamal said nothing. He gently folded the blueprint, seemingly in no hurry at all. But the order in each motion, from the way he smoothed the paper to the gaze that maintained its calm, made Marcus impatient. "What's with that look?" Marcus snarled, trying to mask the feeling of being undermined. No answer. But the very act of not responding, of not participating in the petty game of humiliation, made Marcus feel challenged. For someone like him, passive resistance was more infuriating than outright rebellion. And that was why he continued, even though no one had asked him to. "I don't understand why construction workers think they have the right to intervene in design. That's why we spend years studying to do this job, not relying on field experience and thinking we're geniuses." No one responded. At that moment, the sunlight reflected off the corrugated roof onto the concrete floor, illuminating Jamal's face, causing every quiet feature to shine. It wasn't the light of noisy rebellion, but the light of someone who knew his true worth and was simply waiting for the right moment to lift the veil from the truth. Marcus stepped back, sneered, and signaled to his assistant to reopen the plan. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, but a few people began to look at Jamal differently. They weren't sure what was happening. They just knew that the silent black man was not defeated, and Marcus's smirk was not the end, but only the beginning. No one in the small room on the construction site knew that, as Marcus Ellison began to ramble on about optimal cost slides and construction timeline diagrams on his tablet, Jamal Carter quietly folded his notebook, slipping it into the pocket of his cement-stained blue jacket. No expression, no irritation, not even a hint of resistance. Just a series of slow actions, almost too peaceful. While the engineers around him tried to avoid Marcus's gaze or nervously waited for the monologue to end, Jamal quietly moved to the back of the room. He pulled a faded Nokia 3310 from his pocket, the kind of phone most of the world had long forgotten. But to him, that phone had never left his side. Not just because it was durable, but because it held important calls that should never be traced or synced with any smart system. His rough fingers gently brushed over the keypad. He typed exactly 11 characters. A brief message, no explanation needed. KT3 P15, call back. The message was sent in less than 6 seconds. After that, Jamal stood still, his hand loosely holding the phone in his pocket, his calm gaze directed at the plan board Marcus was still enthusiastically pointing at, as if he were the chief architect of the century. A few minutes later, as Marcus wrapped up his monologue with a self-satisfied nod and said, "All right, does anyone have any questions?" Zrenia, никто не поднял руку. Not because they didn't have questions, but because no one wanted to be the next person humiliated. Jamal nodded politely at Greg, the only engineer who looked at him with a neutral expression, and then silently walked out of the meeting room. He stepped across the cement-dusted pathway, where the midday sun cast long shadows on the rough brick floor. His old leather shoes made heavy but steady clop-clop sounds. This was not the walk of someone who had just been humiliated. There was no disappointment, no anger, not even a lowered head. It was the walk of someone heading to a prearranged meeting, someone who knew their moment had not yet arrived, but was soon to come. Inside, Marcus sat back in a folding chair, leaning back, arms crossed with a half-smile. He turned to his young assistant. "See? These workers now think that knowing a few numbers puts them on the same level as engineers. A little reminder of who's in charge here is all it takes." The assistant smiled and nodded, but his eyes betrayed hesitation. Something felt off. Despite Jamal's silence, that silence wasn't surrender. It was more like waiting. Outside, as Jamal turned toward the administrative container area, his phone vibrated lightly. A reply had come. Confirmed. 14:45, ready. No one on the construction site knew that the name, Jamal Carter, whom they thought was just a simple construction worker, was actually the surface of a much larger, deeper, and more complex identity. And that 14:45 would not only be a site inspection, but the moment when all the prejudice, arrogance, and falseness built up in that meeting room began to crumble. Marcus Ellison's phone rang just as he finished pouring a cup of strong coffee from the expensive thermos placed in the operations trailer. Still smiling contentedly from his victory in the meeting, a dramatic knockout against the black worker who dared to interrupt him, Marcus opened the message and froze immediately. Urgent. The company chairman, Mr. Thomas C. Morgan, will be on site in 15 minutes for an unannounced inspection. All management personnel must assemble. His eyes narrowed. His mouth was about to take a sip, but his hand halted in midair. Thomas C. Morgan. No one mentioned that name lightly. At Eaglestone Constructions, that name was a legend, both inspiring and instilling anxiety. The founder and chairman of the company, an absolute authority but a reclusive figure, Thomas had not personally inspected any project in the past 5 years. Inspections were delegated. He only showed up in cases of severe issues or strategic changes. The last time he unexpectedly visited a construction site. A project manager was fired on the spot for errors in the basement concrete structure. Marcus swallowed hard. His eyes left the phone screen and scanned the office trailer, as if the steel walls might provide him with an answer. Outside, the sound of the steel cutter continued its shrill noise, but something had shifted in the air, as if the very heart of the construction site had tilted by a notch. "Jared," Marcus called his assistant in a low but urgent voice. "Gather the engineering team, check the drawings thoroughly, clean up the documents, reorganize the client meeting area. Everything has to be perfect." Jared froze. "You mean Chairman Morgan is really coming?" Marcus didn't answer. He simply raised the phone, the screen still glowing with the brief but chilling message. And that was enough to send the entire administrative trailer from a slow-working pace into a fevered frenzy, unlike anything the site had experienced since the groundbreaking. Meanwhile, in the workers' parking lot, Jamal Carter, or rather, Thomas Jamal Carter, the chairman of the company, was leisurely opening the trunk of his old silver sedan. A modest car so unassuming that no one would guess who was sitting behind the wheel. Inside the trunk, beneath his worn-out work jacket, was a dark brown leather briefcase, the kind used for top-secret documents, a crisp white shirt neatly ironed, and a pair of thin, silver-rimmed glasses tucked into a gray velvet box. Not hurriedly, not slowly, Jamal changed out of his dusty work clothes and into an appearance few had ever seen on this construction site. He put on the glasses, buttoned his cuffs, opened his watch, then he looked into the rearview mirror. The face in the mirror was no longer that of a humiliated construction worker. It was the face of a leader, a man who knew the weight of silence and understood the value of timing. 14 minutes later. A sleek black Mercedes quietly entered the main gate area. No sirens, no escort, but the silence rang out like the slow ticking of a death knell. Marcus stood right outside the gate, his tie perfectly straight, shoes polished to a mirror shine. He had prepared his greeting, the modest but professional smile, and a scripted opening line. The car stopped. The driver stepped out first, a tall white man dressed in black, clearly a personal security agent. The rear door opened, and it wasn't anyone else who stepped out. It was Jamal, but not Jamal, the construction worker. It was Thomas Jamal Carter, wearing a dark blue suit, a matching tie, his silver-rimmed glasses glinting in the sun, his eyes sharp like a blade just drawn from its sheath. Marcus stood frozen. He was rooted to the spot as if he had been turned to stone. "Excuse me," he stammered. "We were expecting Mr. Thomas C. Morgan." Jamal stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan, it's a pleasure to meet you again. Engineer Ellison." And just like that, the first domino had fallen. But the chain reaction had only just begun. Marcus Ellison stood frozen at the construction gate, as if all the blood had been drained from his body. The confident smile he had been rehearsing all afternoon to greet the imagined chairman now looked distorted, like a note out of tune on a masterpiece painting. In front of him, Jamal Carter, dressed in an elegant suit and exuding an undeniable leadership presence, calmly took out a business card from his inside pocket and coldly handed it over. "Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan, founder and CEO of Eaglestone Constructions." The voice was no longer that of a humble and calm construction worker. It rang clearly, sharp as steel honed to perfection. Each word struck Marcus's temple like a hammer, the same man who just an hour ago had sneered and declared, "We don't pay construction workers to think." The air around them suddenly thickened. The people standing nearby, from engineers to workers, were stunned, their eyes shifting from Marcus to Jamal, as though witnessing a stunning political face turn. Marcus took a step back, blinking repeatedly. I don't understand, but you're the one you just insulted for pointing out a technical flaw in the foundation design." Thomas cut him off, not allowing Marcus to continue with his excuses. "And the one who is here today to see how the site is running. From the inside." The engineers behind Marcus started murmuring. Greg Mitchell sighed, as if a missing puzzle piece had just clicked into place. His gaze now one of understanding, no longer surprised. A young worker whispered under his breath, "Oh my God, Jamal is the chairman?" No one responded, because all of them were faced with a truth too large to accept immediately. The man they had looked down upon, ignored, or even not bothered to notice, was now the one with the power to shut down this entire site with a single nod. Marcus swallowed hard. He tried to recover. If I had known your identity." Thomas narrowed his eyes. Slowly. The next words didn't need to be shouted, because the truth was too obvious to need raising one's voice. "That's the problem, Marcus. If you had known I was the chairman, you wouldn't have dared to say those things. But because you thought I was just a construction worker, a black man without a college degree, you felt entitled to humiliate me." Each word hit Marcus's arrogance like a sledgehammer. The younger engineers started glancing at each other, some avoiding Thomas's gaze. Jared, Marcus's assistant, quietly put his iPad into his bag, as if preparing himself for the storm that was about to hit. Marcus stammered, stepping back toward the trailer as if looking for a place to hide. At that moment, an old voice rose from behind. "I knew it. I knew that look could never be mistaken." Everyone turned around. Walter Green, the veteran site supervisor with weathered skin and graying hair, stepped forward with a half smile. He reached out to shake Thomas's hand warmly. "You should have given us a heads up, Mr. T. Dot." Thomas smiled lightly, the first smile since his reveal. "If I'd given a heads up, how would I have known who truly deserves to hold their position, and who's just playing a part, Walter?" Walter nodded, then turned to face Marcus, his gaze humble but firm. I've known him since the days when we mixed cement by hand in Brooklyn. He didn't rise through the ranks by degrees, but by reputation. And the first thing I learned from Thomas was, a company isn't strong because of a good manager, but because the truth is allowed to exist at every level. Marcus fell silent. There was nothing left to say. The sunlight shone down on his head, making the beads of sweat on his face even more apparent. But Thomas didn't look at him anymore. He turned to the group of engineers, his tone resolute. In 15 minutes, I want a meeting with the entire technical team in the main trailer. Bring all the drawings, foundation analysis charts, and materials records from the past 3 months. Then, he walked away, never once looking back. Behind him, Marcus stood motionless, like a statue, pale, stiff, and exposed. And that was just the beginning of an afternoon where every arrogant brick Marcus had built would begin to crumble, one by one, in the hands of the person he had most underestimated. The air in the construction site's conference room was thick as uncured cement. On one side, Marcus Ellison and the engineering team sat like those who had just walked out of a silent courtroom. On the other, Thomas Jamal Carter, now in the guise of a CEO, stood in front of the large screen displaying the foundation design, the same design he had been ignored for pointing out cracks in just hours before. Next to him was Walter Green, and behind him were 2 technical auditors. All 3 formed an impenetrable defense line. Thomas placed the tablet on the table, connected it to the projector, and then turned around. Without any ceremony, he began. I know you're all wondering why a chairman would wear a construction worker's coat, carry a mortar bucket, and listen to the sounds of the mixer every day like an ordinary laborer. The answer is simple, because I want to know how my company is truly being run, and how my workers are being treated. A few engineers glanced toward Marcus. He lowered his head, sweat beading on his temples. Thomas didn't look at him. His voice was steady, without the need for anger to create pressure. I started my career with nothing, no degree, no assets, just a trowel and a belief that those who work hard deserve to be heard. As the company grew, I started to disguise myself and go on site like a newcomer. No title, no privileges, no name. A young engineer at the corner of the table subtly shifted, his gaze hesitant as he looked at Thomas, as if trying to determine, did I laugh yesterday when Marcus humiliated Jamal? Thomas slowly walked toward the center of the room, then stopped. He pulled out an old printed blueprint from his inner pocket and placed it on the table. This is the Northeast Foundation design. Everyone approved and implemented it without making any changes from the original. He pointed to a red circle on a specific point. But this area, as I warned, is under cross-pressure from the slope of the terrain, and today it has started to show level 1 cracks, just as I said this morning. The room went silent. Thomas looked around. Then his gaze settled on Marcus, who still didn't dare to lift his head. And the scariest part is not that you insulted me, Marcus, but that if I were truly just a construction worker, you would still think that insulting me, dismissing warnings, and degrading others' dignity is acceptable behavior. Walter stepped forward and placed a thick stack of files on the table. We've checked, and just as Mr. Carter said, the ground slope is off by 3 degrees from the theoretical calculations. Cracks have started to appear in the foundation. If not addressed, within 6 weeks, the project will face the risk of localized settlement. A wave of unease swept through the engineering team. No one said a word, because they all knew this wasn't just a technical error. It was a mistake built on arrogance. Thomas turned to the audit team. What's next? One of the auditors opened the report. We found 17 violations, including changing materials from the original contract, falsifying load-bearing parameters, failing to perform complete microstructural tests, and evidence of falsifying foundation test results to accelerate progress. At that moment, Marcus was no longer the chief engineer from the morning. He was just a man hunched over in his chair, his collar unbuttoned, tie askew, his eyes avoiding the truth like someone who knew the storm was coming from the hands they had created. Thomas walked closer, not threatening, not scolding, but every step he took forced Marcus to face the truth. You once told me that you don't pay construction workers to think, but if you had listened this morning just once, you could have avoided this crack, not just on the blueprint, but in your entire career. He paused, lowering his voice, just enough for Marcus to hear. The problem isn't your knowledge. It's your mistaken belief that those beneath you have nothing to teach you, and that belief will collapse your career, just like this foundation, one crack at a time. Outside the trailer, the sound of drills continued steadily, but in this room there was only the quiet collapse of a man who had built walls from prejudice. In the room, now thick with the stifling air of exposed truth, every word from Thomas Carter struck like a series of blows against the foundation of power that Marcus Ellison had once stood upon with unwavering confidence. But what Marcus didn't anticipate was that even within his own team, there were those who had known, or at least recognized the truth, long before now. Amid the tense silence, a slow but resonant voice rose from the back of the room. We used to mix cement when this company was just 5 people. Everyone turned. Gregory Mitchell, the seasoned structural engineer, with his graying beard and slender frame, stood firm like a pillar of iron. He stepped out from the engineer's row, still clutching his worn-out field notebook, the kind only the truly dedicated still kept. His gaze locked onto Marcus's, not raising his voice, but the weight of his disappointment was enough to make a man like Marcus falter. I've been here since the very first day. I've seen Thomas build this company from a barren plot of land, not with power, but with trust in the workers, by listening even when the person speaking had never set foot in college. Gregory turned to look at Thomas, giving a subtle nod, as if acknowledging that he should have seen him sooner and might have done something to prevent what had just unfolded. I didn't recognize you, Thomas, but now I understand. That calmness, it's just like when you were Jamal, mixing mortar behind the test factory building. Thomas gave a slight nod, saying nothing, but in his eyes there was a rare warmth, like a ray of light piercing through the dense, heavy clouds. Meanwhile, Marcus sat like a statue on the verge of breaking. His throat felt dry, his hands trembled slightly, his gaze constantly darting to the reports the auditors were flipping through. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning still running. Another engineer sitting beside him, Aaron Langley, the supervising engineer for the foundation pour, couldn't take the silence any longer and suddenly spoke up. I tried to raise the alarm a few weeks ago. I sent an email warning about the northeast corner pressure, but Marcus said we were just messing up the schedule. He told us to stick to the original design, that it was the approved optimal plan. Exactly, a younger engineer chimed in. When we saw the foundation settling 2 millimeters off, Marcus still signed off on the next concrete pour. I noted it down, but later I saw the report had been altered. Each word felt like another needle pricking away at Marcus's career survival chances. He no longer resisted, no longer denied. There was only one thing left: fear. Not the fear of being fired, but the fear that everything he had built through arrogance and concealment was now being laid bare, right in front of the person he had once deemed invisible in the system. Thomas watched. No anger, just a cold silence. Then he stepped towards Marcus's desk. "I will ask again, one last time, and this time, not for me, but for all those who had to bear the silence for this project to be completed." He paused, allowing the room to go completely still. You knew the project was off track. You knew the foundation was faulty, but you ignored it all for what? Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat felt choked. I just thought if we cut a few steps in the checks, we'd save enough to hit the quarterly bonus threshold. Each person in the management team would get a share. I didn't think it was that serious." He bent down, covering his face with his hands. The collapse had finally arrived. Walter stepped forward, his eyes filled with repressed frustration. "You didn't think it was serious? When an office building could collapse in its first year of use, just because of a few percentage points in bonus money." Thomas turned, walking toward the whiteboard where the project map still bore the markings from the morning. His voice, though not loud, echoed across the room. "The building doesn't collapse because of wind, doesn't fall due to a storm. It collapses because of the silence of those who knew but didn't speak, and because of the arrogance of those at the top who never learned how to listen." And in that moment, everyone in the room realized this meeting was no longer an internal review. It had become a trial, a living indictment of a management model that was cracking at its very foundation. The silence that filled the meeting room was shattered by the deafening sound of the projector as Thomas Carter turned around and lightly tapped the tablet. With just a swipe, the entire digital system of the company connected to the projector, and before everyone's eyes appeared a series of charts and audit reports, not drafts, but the official findings from the internal audit team Thomas had quietly sent 3 weeks ago. "We don't need to wait any longer," Thomas said, his tone no longer one of questioning but the firm assertion of a judge. "I requested a full review of all technical records from the start of the quarter, and here's what we found." On the screen, the numbers lit up. 17 serious technical violations. 4 falsified foundation inspection reports. C-grade steel was replaced with C-, 30% cheaper. 3 structural changes made without internal approval procedures. 2 instances where foundation crack reports were deleted from the risk management system. One of the auditors stepped forward, placing a copy of the summary report in front of everyone. Each page was marked in red: documents, signatures, timestamps, no doubts, no more ignorance. The entire technical management system was manipulated at the upper levels, the auditor said. And the final approver for all changes was the chief engineer, Marcus Ellison. All eyes turned to Marcus. He lifted his head, his face pale, eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to cling to. Then, almost in desperation, Marcus opened his mouth, his voice hoarse. I can explain." Thomas didn't take his eyes off him, but this time he allowed Marcus to speak. A silence stretched on like it would never end. Then Marcus began, his words fragmented, broken like the cracked foundation of the building he had ignored. "At first, it was for the schedule. We were delayed due to rain. Management put pressure on us. I cut some non-mandatory inspection steps. Then, when I saw the material costs exceeding the plan, I agreed to replace the steel. The supplier suggested the C- grade, and they assured me it would still bear the load. And then the year-end bonus. If we exceeded the $1 million savings target, the whole design team would share it. I just thought I was optimizing for the company." Thomas didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He stood still, his gaze seeming to pierce into the deepest corners of Marcus's conscience. Then Thomas's voice came, low and steady, but as heavy as concrete falling. "You cut inspections to keep the schedule. You replaced steel to save costs. You altered records to bypass the system. And you used the slogan for the company's benefit to cover up a series of actions for personal gain." A young engineer sitting next to him whispered, "For a bonus, he bet the lives of hundreds of people working here every day." Walter nodded, his gaze heavy. "And thousands will work in that building for the next 30 years. Thomas turned to the engineering team. "I want to be clear on one thing. Who among you warned Marcus about any of this?" At first, no one moved, but then, one by one, Aaron Langley, the foundation inspection supervisor, stood up. "I spoke up. Twice, but was brushed off." Derek Owens, in charge of material testing, nodded. "I sent a report about the steel compression discrepancies, but then I saw the report was altered." A young intern, nearly trembling, whispered, "I thought, I'm just an intern. I didn't dare." Thomas didn't blame them. He just nodded slightly, as if to confirm. The fault wasn't with those below who didn't dare to speak, but with those above who didn't allow others to speak up. He walked to the end of the table, opened a folder marked Internal Confidential. "I have two choices for you, Marcus Ellison." The entire room held its breath. Marcus gripped the armrests of his chair tightly. He knew this wasn't just a choice about his job. This was a decision that would determine the rest of his career and his honor. Thomas flipped through the folder, his voice firm. Choice 1, termination for serious ethical and technical violations, and the company will file a civil lawsuit for fraud, falsifying documents and endangering the project. Result, loss of professional license, career over. Choice 2, voluntary resignation. Return the entire bonus and spend 6 months teaching voluntarily at Eaglestone's Technical Training Center for underprivileged youth. No salary, no title, just a person sharing what he once thought he understood. You have 5 minutes. No one laughed, no one gloated, because this was no longer just an internal review. This was the moment justice arrived in silence, and the most arrogant man had to bow his head, not out of fear, but because he was finally facing himself. As the clock on the wall slowly ticked down the remaining time for Marcus Ellison to make his final decision for his career, Thomas Carter stood still beside the tablet, the light from the screen reflecting off his silver-rimmed glasses, making his eyes shine with an even colder edge. No one expected what came next, a final, decisive blow, not in anger, not with drama, but with just a gentle tap. Beep! The sound rang from the room's sound system, and right after that, a familiar voice echoed, clear, full, undeniable. "We work here by calculation, not by some laborers building blindly." The room went silent. Everyone realized this was a recording from the morning meeting, when Marcus openly humiliated Jamal, whom he had thought was just a construction worker. No one interrupted him, no one objected, and now that very moment echoed like a court without a judge. Thomas muted the sound. No need to say anything more. His eyes, fixed directly on Marcus, replaced all words. At that moment, Marcus Ellison no longer looked like the chief engineer, the coordinator, or the leader. He was just a man hearing his own voice, filled with arrogance, malice, and ignorance, and realizing that the mask he had worn was just ripped off. No one forced him. He had confessed with his own words. His tie had loosened. His sleeves were rolled up, though he hadn't noticed when. But the clearest thing was his vacant, stunned expression, like someone who had just woken up from a nightmare, only to find out it was real. A young engineer who hadn't said a word throughout the meeting quietly whispered, "All he did, in the end, pushed himself into the deepest pit of the pedestal he thought he was standing on." Thomas remained silent for a long while, letting Marcus feel each heavy second of the consequences. Then, for the first time during the entire meeting, he spoke, his voice calm, almost unexpectedly so. "You know, Marcus, the most ironic thing is that if you had just stopped and listened to a worker, if you had just set your ego aside once, you could have impressed me." He walked slowly to the table where Marcus sat, leaned down and spoke in a voice that only the two of them could hear. "And today, instead of facing indictment, you could have been considered for the position of technical director for the entire Eastern region." Marcus's eyes widened. He couldn't find words. His lips moved, but his throat felt like it was choking. "You didn't lose because you lacked ability. You lost because you thought you were too good to learn from others." Thomas stood up straight and turned to walk toward the back of the room. "Time is up. Jared," he called his assistant. An envelope was placed on the table in front of Marcus. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. One was the termination letter with the technical charges. The other was a voluntary resignation agreement along with the plan to teach for 6 months at the Community Technical Training Center. Marcus stared at the 2 sheets before him, as though they were 2 verdicts, neither easy, but there was something else he couldn't ignore. The gazes from the dozens of people in the room, no longer looking at him with envy or admiration as they had before. Now, there was silence mixed with pity, the bitter look that those who have once been at the top fear most. Thomas turned to Jared. "Inform the team leaders. In 10 minutes, I'll make a statement to all the workers outside in the main yard." Gregory Mitchell nodded gently. Aaron Langley picked up the walkie-talkie. No one questioned. No one interfered. Because everyone knew that moment had come, when the founder of the company officially broke the silence, overturned the power structure, and laid down a new foundation with the voice of truth. As the clock on the wall marked the exact hour, and the evening light slanted through the glass of the operations trailer, no one in the room dared to move. Not out of fatigue, but because everyone was witnessing the moment a monument of power was crumbling, not due to an earthquake, but because the moral foundation had long been hollow. Marcus Ellison, who once sat at the head of the table, pointing orders, silencing opposing views with a raised eyebrow, a sarcastic comment, was now hunched over in the cold metal chair. He wasn't looking at anyone. He didn't speak. He just sat there, between 2 pieces of paper, one a verdict, the other a chance for redemption. And Thomas didn't wait any longer. He walked slowly to the center of the meeting room, his eyes scanning each face. Engineers, supervisors, auditors, assistants, even those who had been silent yet burdened. Then he spoke, his tone calm but as firm as steel. "For the safety of the project, for professional ethics, for the trust that Eaglestone was once built on, I declare Marcus Ellison is officially no longer part of Eaglestone Constructions." A moment of silence. No applause, no cheers, just the weight of justice being executed. Jared, the coordinating assistant, stepped forward to open the trailer door, allowing Thomas to walk straight into the main yard. And there, a crowd of workers, on-site engineers, logistics staff had gathered, standing scattered across the concrete yard, initially out of curiosity, but now waiting. They didn't know what had happened in that room, but from Aaron Langley's quiet gaze, from Derek Owens's pale face as he walked out of the trailer, from the slam of the door closing behind Marcus, they knew. Something monumental had just ended. Thomas stepped onto a makeshift wooden platform, two steel frames stacked together. No microphone, no screen. Just one voice, deep, warm, clear, echoing across the construction site like the sound of stakes being driven into the ground. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I am Thomas Jamal Carter, the founder and chairman of Eaglestone Constructions. Dozens of eyes widened. A few looked at each other shocked, dropping their masks. Those who had once called him Jamal, the new guy, the fast-mixing black guy, now stood motionless, mouths agape, as if they had just witnessed someone transform into a dragon. For the past 4 weeks, I've been working at this site as a construction worker. No title, no privileges, no name. Because I wanted to see my company from below. I wanted to understand whether the values we built it on still exist. Thomas paused for a moment. The wind lightly blew, lifting the hem of his jacket. I've seen the good, your patience, your diligence, and your team spirit, but I've also seen the silence from fear and the arrogance of those who have forgotten they were once ordinary workers. The crowd was now so quiet that the sound of wind brushing against the crane's arm could be heard. And today, I am here to confirm one thing. Marcus Ellison, the chief engineer of this project, has officially left the company due to serious ethical and technical violations. A wave of sound rippled across the site. Some whispered to their colleagues, some clenched their fists, but no one laughed because they all understood. This wasn't an act of vengeance, but a recalibration of the entire system. Thomas raised his hand, signaling for silence. I am not here to tear anyone down. I'm here to rebuild, from the very first bricks. So, starting next week, Eaglestone will expand its free technical training program for underprivileged youth, and for those who have been looked down upon by society. The instructors won't be speakers, they won't be professors. They will be those who have fallen. He turned towards the trailer. And at that moment, Marcus Ellison stepped out, holding a small cardboard box with his personal belongings. His face was devoid of expression. His steps slow, not from fatigue, but because each step now was a blow to the self-esteem he had just seen collapse. No one jeered, no one mocked, but they didn't look away. They watched, not with contempt, but with something perhaps even more painful. Pity. Thomas watched him go. No satisfaction, no glare. Just a nod, not of forgiveness, but of acceptance of the final choice, the path to redemption. Walter Green approached Thomas, his voice low. Chose option 2, huh? Thomas nodded slightly. 6 months, teaching at the Woodrow Center in the Northern Suburban District. No salary, no privileges. Walter smiled, half mocking, half respectful. You still believe in the power of change, just like when we used to mix cement together. If we don't believe people can change, Thomas said, his eyes still on Marcus's retreating back, then we're just building houses on the ashes of belief. As the last cardboard box in Marcus Ellison's hands disappeared behind the temporary gate of the construction site, the air seemed to release a collective pressure, not through cheers, but through a collective sigh of relief. His presence had once cast a shadow over safety meetings, mid-shift inspections, and casual conversations in the break room. Now, that shadow had been torn apart. On the makeshift wooden platform, Thomas Carter still stood tall, the wind lifting the hem of his jacket, the late afternoon sunlight casting a golden hue on the unfinished concrete floor. Behind him were not blueprints or progress charts, but faces weathered by the sun from long hours on the site, hardened by the many times they had been overlooked. They weren't wearing suits, they didn't carry ID badges, but now, for the first time, they stood in the center of attention. Thomas's eyes scanned the crowd. He saw Rosa, the petite woman in charge of the supply warehouse, who had been interrupted by Marcus countless times just for speaking too much. He saw Tyrell, the black machinist who had been criticized for daring to suggest replacing a miscalibrated pressure valve, even though he was right. He saw Luis, the young mason who had kept silent several times when he saw the ground sinking, simply because no one had asked. Then Thomas spoke, slowly, like each word was a chisel carving away at the invisible block of prejudice and arrogance. "I've worked with you for the past 4 weeks under the name Jamal. No business cards, no office, no title. I've heard you speak about what makes you frustrated, what makes you want to quit, and what keeps you working under this blazing sun. And I've realized the true value of this company has never been in air-conditioned rooms or Zoom meetings. It's in all of you, the ones who know every crack in the floor, the strange squeal of steel, and the silences when someone isn't being listened to." He paused for a moment, not to catch his breath, but to let the words sink in like water seeping through dry soil. "Today, I fired a chief engineer, not because he lacked expertise, but because he believed only a degree was a worthy voice. He forgot that a project is built by many hands, and each hand has a brain above it." At that moment, applause erupted, not in unison, not led by anyone, but spontaneous. And it wasn't applause for someone being fired, but for the fact that finally they were seen. Thomas raised his hand, signaling for silence to return, then continued. "Starting next week, I will implement a new policy. Every worker, engineer, and administrative staff member at Eaglestone will have the right to identify and report technical risks without going through their direct supervisor. The suggestions will go directly to the Safety Review Board of the Executive Committee. We will begin the Voice from the Ground program, where technical suggestions from the field are taken seriously. If a proposal is viable, the person who submits it will receive a reward equal to that of the design team." A whistle sounded. A few people smiled. Faces that had always bowed in silence were now standing straight, like steel columns waiting for the foundation to be poured. Thomas continued, his tone softening. "Here, degrees do not define value. Experience, ethics, and respect are the foundation of every project. I know you don't need anyone to shout slogans. You just need to know that when you speak up, there will be someone to listen. And today, I want to be the first to prove that." Once again, applause rang out, louder, longer, more confident. No more hesitation, no more bowed heads, because, for the first time, that applause was for them. 6 months after the day the Eaglestone construction site was shaken by Thomas Carter's speech, on a gloomy winter morning stretching across the northern suburbs, the location of the Woodrow Technical Training Center, the newest branch in Eaglestone's nonprofit training network. The modest, faded greenhouses, cracked in places, didn't look like a place that could change lives. But it was here, in this quiet process of transformation, that a silent reformation was taking place. In classroom 4B, the sound of chalk on the blackboard echoed. Marcus Ellison, no longer the arrogant chief engineer, stood at the front of the class holding a ruler, sketching a wall foundation pressure diagram. His expensive suit was gone. In its place were a faded shirt, simple khaki pants, and a look, still sharp, but different. No longer was his gaze darting around, looking for someone else's mistake. No longer was there a sneer when someone misspoke a formula. Instead, Marcus watched carefully as a student drew, gently correcting errors, patiently explaining things for the third time if necessary. If you look closely at the clay content in this soil sample, you'll see why the foundation needs additional beams, not because of theory, but because in practice, it could collapse. The class sat in silence, listening intently. The boys from the temporary housing, the girls who had never held a technical pen, now sat upright, taking notes, nodding along. Not because Marcus was particularly brilliant, but because he had learned how to become someone who could be trusted. Through the classroom's glass window, Thomas Carter stood with his arms crossed, silently watching. Next to him was Gregory Mitchell, an old friend from Eaglestone's early days, now overseeing the Second Foundation program, an initiative that trained people who had made technical mistakes to become instructors in the Reformation process. Greg nodded slightly, half joking, half serious. He really chose Reformation? Thomas didn't look at Greg. His eyes were still on Marcus, who was bent over helping a student adjust the measuring tool. He chose, voluntarily, no salary, no reduction in time, no recognition. He just asked one question: if I do the right thing, will anyone believe me again? Greg didn't respond immediately. He only sighed softly, his gaze softening. Then he asked, "And do you believe him?" Thomas nodded slowly. It's not about belief, it's about giving him a chance to rebuild his own foundation. And I believe if someone has made a mistake once, they will learn to appreciate every brick. Inside the classroom, Marcus was packing up the model after the students had practiced measuring compression strength. A curly-haired girl, about 17 years old, raised her hand. "Mr. Marcus, if you had built something wrong in the past, did anyone give you a chance to fix it?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the question. The whole class turned to look at him, waiting. A moment of silence passed. Then he placed the model down, exhaled softly. "No one gave me a chance. I took it myself. And I learned that when you're wrong, don't expect to erase it. Learn to fix it piece by piece, like we do with a cracked foundation." In the hallway, Thomas smiled softly. Not a smile of triumph, but a smile of someone who had just seen a broken foundation, beginning to be poured again, by the very hands that caused it to collapse. Greg opened the door and knocked lightly. "Break time, Mr. Marcus?" Marcus looked up. For the first time in many months, his eyes shone with something real, not pride, but faith. 15 more minutes, Greg. The kids are finishing the final test." Greg turned to Thomas. "There's real hope." Thomas nodded. Hope always lies in the courage to give others a chance to atone, rather than lock them forever in their mistakes. On a late winter afternoon, when the pale sunlight slanted through the dusty window panes of the second floor of Eaglestone's headquarters, Marcus Ellison entered the office of the chairman. Gone was the heavy suit he once wore like armor. He wore a gray shirt now, holding an envelope with documents, not formal, but neat. His gait still had the air of someone accustomed to leading, but his steps were slower, more humble, as though every step was now weighed with meaning from within. Thomas Carter was reviewing the design improvements for the Foundation Forward program, but when he heard the knock on the door, he immediately looked up. Their eyes met. For the first time in 6 months, there was no confrontation, no atmosphere of a trial waiting for a verdict. There were just two people, one who had given a chance and one who had returned to say that he had not wasted it. Marcus placed the folder on the table. He didn't sit immediately, just stood there. "I've been offered positions by a few companies." His voice was deep, direct, without preamble. A project coordinator role in Texas. 2 other places offered technical management positions. Good pay, full benefits. No one asks about my past. Thomas wasn't surprised. He knew Marcus had the expertise. What he was waiting for was what Marcus would say next. Marcus took a deep breath. "But I didn't accept any of them. I want to stay here for 1 more semester." Thomas tilted his head. He didn't interrupt. Marcus continued more slowly. There are a few students I don't want to leave behind. Terrence just finished learning sectioning. Myra is just starting to understand slump testing. She's good, quick. Just a few more months and... He paused, then chuckled softly, as if realizing something. A few months ago, I couldn't even remember the names of the workers beneath me. Now, I count each one. Thomas smiled, a real smile. Not out of forgiveness, not out of leniency, but because he saw the transformation. The change didn't come from the fall, but from how the fallen chose to rise, walking differently than they had before. He said, "You don't need to ask. If you feel there's more for you to do, then Eagle Stone still has a place for you." Marcus nodded slightly. His eyes sparkled, but not out of simple emotion. It was because for the first time, after all those years hiding behind status and degrees, he was being accepted not for a title, but for his true worth. They sat down together, sharing a simple cup of coffee. No files, no contracts, just a conversation between two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield, now both looking toward a ground that could be rebuilt, if the foundation beneath it was solid enough. Before Marcus left, he stood at the door and turned back. "Thomas, do you think, has anyone ever been like me, without a chance like I had?" Thomas didn't hesitate. Many. And that's why the training program can't end. Because if only one Marcus changes, it's not enough. I want to see an entire generation who don't have to fall before they learn humility. Marcus nodded. He understood. And for the first time in his life, he didn't see the role of Reformation instructor as a punishment, but as an honor. Outside the glass door, the concrete buildings continued to rise. But for Thomas and Marcus, there was something more important. The invisible foundation within people, slowly being poured again through listening, correcting mistakes, and the belief that people can rebuild themselves. When the office door closed behind Marcus Ellison, leaving behind a voluntary decision and a rare transformation, Thomas Carter returned to his desk with a heavy yet clear sense of purpose. It wasn't heavy because of what had happened, but because this awakening couldn't stop with just one person. It had to become a foundation. And so, a week later, at a special internal meeting of Eaglestone, Thomas officially announced an unprecedented series of reforms in the company's history. He stood before the board, engineers, management staff, and even the invited team leaders with a voice that was not flowery but certain, like someone who had just touched the cracks in the old structure. "We've just witnessed a truth. A skilled engineer can become the greatest danger if they lack humility and the ability to listen, and a seemingly ordinary worker can see what the blueprint never showed." Thomas stepped into the middle of the room, without a podium, without PowerPoint. "Starting today, every employee, from the chief engineer to the laborer, has the right to speak up about any technical, ethical, or procedural issues, no matter the rank, no fear of retaliation, and most importantly, they must receive feedback within 48 hours. A wave of whispers spread. Those who had once been silent, those who hesitated when they saw mistakes but didn't speak up, began to raise their heads. They understood that the system was no longer sealed off by walls of titles. At the same time, the Mentorship from the Ground program was officially announced, a revolutionary initiative in the construction industry. All young workers with experience and skills would be selected for an intensive training program. They would be trained by both specialized instructors and people like Marcus, who had experienced failure and learned from his mistakes. Each participant who completed the program would receive a technical certification along with a job offer for Eaglestone's projects. "We don't just want to build buildings," Thomas said in his speech at the National Construction Engineering Conference. We want to build generations of workers who can hold their heads high, not because of degrees, but because of the real value they create. The result? In just 6 months, the safety rate at the main construction site soared by 78%. No more delayed reports, no more unforeseen incidents swept under the rug. Employees reported issues faster. Technical teams reacted immediately. And, most importantly, no one was laughed at for being inferior in technical meetings. Other construction companies began to take notice. Initially, there were invitations for Thomas to share the model at industry seminars. Then, representatives from domestic and international firms came to visit, to learn. Some large companies proposed purchasing the rights to the mentorship program for internal use. But Thomas declined commercialization. Trust is not built by contracts. It must be planted and maintained, like a foundation that, if someone rushes to pour concrete, will never be strong enough. At the headquarters of Eaglestone, where once hung prestigious titles and big contracts, there now hung a large photograph in the main lobby. A worker in a stained outfit was pointing to a blueprint. Beside him, a young engineer was listening intently. Beneath the photo was a simple caption: "Knowing less doesn't mean not knowing what's right." The 30-story Eaglestone Tower now stands complete, proudly rising in the heart of the financial district, its glass facade reflecting the soft afternoon light like a tranquil lake. Yet, what stops people as they step into the lobby isn't the modern interior details or the wall covered in international partner lists. It's the gold-plated sign, prominently placed on a white marble backdrop, in the one spot where anyone passing by is bound to read it. We build with materials, but we rise with humility. Thomas Carter walks past that sign every morning at 6:45 a.m., a habit carried from his days as a laborer. But he doesn't look at it with simple pride. For Thomas, it's not a trophy, it's a reminder. A reminder of Jamal, of Marcus, of the hundreds of people who were sidelined simply because they didn't wear a suit or know how to open a CAD file. On the 30th floor meeting room, once reserved for leadership-only discussions, now transformed into a community mentorship room, where technical trainees from the Mentorship from the Ground program are invited to participate in orientation sessions, present ideas, and even critique internal policies. And one afternoon, Marcus Ellison, now a senior instructor for the program, walked into the class with his canvas backpack, rolled-up sleeves, and name tag pinned to his chest: Marcus E., Field Technical Instructor. By the time the 6-month volunteer program ended, Marcus had received 3 official offers to return to the industry, one from a private contractor in California, one from a project management firm in Denver, and another from a multinational corporation in Switzerland. He turned them all down, not because he wasn't capable of returning, but because he understood. If he left now, he would be abandoning what he never had: the opportunity to make things right, a space to rebuild. In a private conversation with Thomas, when asked why, Marcus simply said, "I spent nearly 20 years climbing a tower made of reputation and ego, but it only took one meeting to see how hollow it truly was. If I rebuild now, I want to build with people, not with titles." Down in the Eaglestone Tower lobby, a group of interns is being taught the surveying process for the expansion project on the east side. One girl in the group, her hair tied up, dark skin, graphite smudges on her hands from the morning's sketching session, raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Marcus, what do we do if one day we stand in front of someone with power, but they're wrong? What should we do?" Marcus didn't rush to answer. He bent down, picked up a small pebble from the construction site, and held it up for the group to see. "This isn't on the blueprint, But if it's in the wrong spot, it could misalign the whole foundation. Meaning, anything, even the smallest thing, if not spoken out, can bring the entire structure down. He looked around at the makeshift outdoor classroom. So, the answer is, speak up. With kindness, with understanding, but speak up. Because if you don't, you're not just failing the project, you're failing yourself. Back on the 30th floor, Thomas Carter stood before the glass window, looking out at the avenue below. The cars still flowed, the construction still buzzed, and the reports still piled up on his desk. But in that moment, he placed his hand on the newly installed stainless steel plaque affixed to the glass wall next to the meeting room. The strongest structure isn't built with steel, it's built with respect. He didn't need to engrave anyone's name on that phrase, because he understood. The greatest structures are not what we leave on the ground, but what we imprint in the hearts of others. Eaglestone is no longer just a construction company, it is a culture, a commitment that from now on, no one will be underestimated simply because their hands are stained with cement. No one will be forced into silence because the title of the one in the wrong is too great, and no one will have to sit alone, piecing together every brick in their heart, if there is someone willing to help them rebuild. No matter how tall or modern a building might be, it won't last long if its foundation is built on arrogance, silence, and contempt for others. But if that foundation is built on humility, listening, and belief in the ability to change, then miracles will not only happen on the ground, but within every person. Marcus Ellison's story is not just a journey of redemption. It is proof that everyone can fall, but everyone can also be rebuilt if someone has the courage to not close the final door. So, what about you? If you were in Thomas's position, would you give Marcus a second chance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story made you reflect, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other inspiring content from us. We tell stories not just to inspire, but to open up a world where human value is built on respect, not prejudice. Because every tower starts with a foundation, and so do people.